Recently, I watched Paramount Plus's new Halo TV series. At the time of this video, I'll only have watched one episode, and I don't know if I'll continue yet. I know a lot of fans are groaning about the lack of canon and other aspects of the show, while supporters of the show have begun crying out against toxic fans and then dismissing many criticisms. None of this video is done with the intent of fostering disrespect between one group or the other, but I do have my honest take. After viewing the first episode, knowing it wasn't canon, there were some things I liked and many things I didn't. What I want to do today is break down the first episode, not exactly as a reviewer, but as a writer. For me, the storytelling felt like it was one of the weaker parts of the show, and for someone who bothered getting a formal education in writing, there is a way to analyze and critique the effectiveness of fictional storycraft. That's what I aim to do. I won't be drawing much attention to minor details like Chief's voice, the props, or casting issues, which don't apply to something that's non-canon. Instead, I'm going to be workshopping the story, covering aspects of the writing such as the plot, characterization, scenes, and dialogue. If anyone is unfamiliar with the concept of workshopping, it's a process that's used in the writing community, often in creative writing courses, in which a writer presents the draft of their original work and then receives productive feedback and critique from their peers. Often, the class and a moderator sits in a large group and has an open discussion about the work in front of the writer. The writer isn't allowed to defend or explain their work during the process, but of course, it's up to them which advice they take and which they ignore when they do their rewrite. In general, during a workshop, it's simply good form to be productive and professional, if not a little funny here and there. But I've sat in classes where people cried or got angry because their work received criticism. Sometimes it was given fairly, other times their fellow students could be pretty blunt. Basically, here I'm going to be replicating this process and applying it to the first episode of the new Halo TV series. While it's a finished piece of writing, I'm going to be treating it as if it's a draft of someone's work and was presented to me for peer feedback. So the TV series begins on the outer colony of Madrigal. The first characters we see are insurrectionists, who are having a bit of exposition via dialogue. At this time, none of them are aware of the Covenant threat, but the existing conflict between the rebels and the UNSC are brought up, as well as knowledge of the Spartans. Here, I would have the dialogue hint more at just how ignorant of the Covenant the rebels actually are, just as foreshadowing that they think the UNSC is their biggest problem. I actually love all of these unique people we're introduced to, especially Quan's father. So naturally, they're all killed off, which is very convenient for the plot. Killing off the hometown is one of the fiction tropes I personally dislike, only because it's really just a pass for the main character to be free without having to worry about familial ties or attachments to a certain place. The father really was interesting. He even had some good stakes and characterization in the battle before being killed in honestly kind of a generic way. I enjoyed the opening battle and loved when Chief dropped in, but it was weird when the general instantly tried to kill him. It makes sense, but the way he shouted and turned from the obviously greater threat of deadly aliens he'd never seen before was incredibly hammy and a little nonsensical. But soon, they both start to work together, which hints at a possible future where maybe the UNSC and the rebels can set aside their differences. This should definitely be hinted at more. As it is, the show seems to be intensely focused on the struggle of the insurrectionists against the UNSC. In portraying this, it's quite clear that this is more of a black and white dynamic, similar to the Empire versus the rebels from Star Wars. Sadly, this severely weakens the writing of the show. While another sci-fi series, such as The Expanse, is able to create three unique people groups with their own complex flaws and qualities, the three groups shown in Halo so far don't appear to be portrayed with anything more than a two-dimensional level of development. The UNSC is portrayed as militaristic and oppressive, a very real perspective from the standpoint of the insurrectionists, but overall an entirely shallow take from just one viewpoint. While I'm not demanding canon representation, the canon depiction of this conflict is much more gray. The show writing here is currently weak because they're sitting on top of topics that could be deeper, but as writers, they've intentionally chosen not to make use of more advanced world building. Adaptations have a lot of potential, and shows like The Expanse may take their liberties and deviate from the books here or there, but they do all they can to maximize the potential given from the plots and lore of the source material. This series does not try to do that, and it is a decision that has severely weakened the quality of writing. In the first episode, not only is there a lot of exposition-heavy dialogue, but we get this rushed buildup of tension with characters we hardly even know. Because keep in mind, these are non-canon characters. Therefore, the writers should not be writing them with the expectation that we already know who they are and care about their struggles. As viewers, we haven't been around these characters long enough, and our care for them really can't be forced. So when they have emotional breakdowns and bicker among themselves, it comes off as incredibly shallow, as if the writers are simply saying, "Come on guys, just believe that there's a problem between these characters. Just believe that this emotional development is so moving and deep." But all I could think was, hey, I don't really know these people yet. We haven't earned the emotional development. We haven't earned any of the buildup that explodes into insubordination and conflict among the ranks, because we haven't been properly introduced to the UNSC. We haven't had time with them yet. They're currently a very shallow militaristic faction that the show spends so much time wagging their fingers at. As a result, it's not a difficult decision for Chief to walk away. That means there's actually no tension at the end of the episode, because the buildup is heavily contrived and it's a no-brainer for him to leave. Imagine how much more complex the story would be if we actually included the fact that the UNSC is the only thing slowing down the genocide of humanity. From that perspective, it actually becomes a difficult choice that Chief has to make when he chooses to go rogue. This means he is abandoning the UNSC and leaving the more populated human worlds to fight on their own without him. But there would be a chance that he might discover something to help save the world, both UNSC and rebels, so maybe it's worth it. We don't know if he makes the right call, and that creates tension. But here, the show shoots itself in the foot by not setting up the Human Covenant War in favor of depicting the insurrection like it's the Rebel Alliance. So far, his only motivation is to defy his unjust orders, explore his emotions, and be free from military service. Here, Chief rightfully defies his orders because Parangoski is evil, which she really is, and they did get that right. Now, I think the entire situation could have played out with better solutions if it took place after Chief returned to Reach, rather than playing out on the Condor. Not only would we get better character development by actually seeing Chief doing things among the UNSC, but we would also have many ways in which the characters can actually defy Parangoski by working together to ensure Kwan's survival. This would show the tension and differing beliefs in the UNSC, instead of just using forced dialogue and contrived situations to tell us about it. It's important to understand why we need to have more nuance in creating the organizations and factions. Making them deeper gives us more room to discover solutions for whenever we write ourselves into a corner. The UNSC being so black and white doesn't really provide complexity to the world. It just fills the space with a cookie-cutter obstacle. It's clutter. The stakes just aren't convincing because we know they're bad and wrong and Chief is good and right. The Keyes family could have easily been given a chance to subvert their orders and trick Parangoski, doing the right thing and showing us the viewers that they and Chief would be future allies. Instead, they follow orders like drones and aren't able to think for themselves. A very childish and, once again, two-dimensional take when it comes to human behavior, especially in the military. Speaking of nonsensical behavior, let's talk about Miranda. Oh, Miranda. I don't know what they plan to do with you as a character, but they could be doing it better. So far, she's a character with a lot of potential and a conscience, while Jacob is now a monster who's cool with killing civilians and shooting at the chief. The problem I have with Miranda is that she was squandered in her introductory scene. When she comes online to debrief, or as I see it, quote, not interrogate Quan, she ends up giving a prepared, company man PR speech asking the girl to speak up for the UNSC. Honestly, she asked Quan to just tell the truth, that the UNSC showed up and saved her from the aliens. Quan instead gets in her face and declines aggressively, even threatening to blackmail the UNSC by spreading misinformation and blaming them instead. The problem I have with this scene is how Miranda, the military officer, is cowed by this young girl who heaps accusations against the UNSC upon her. The power dynamics of this conversation make no sense. Quan is, for all intents and purposes, in the custody of the UNSC. Miranda has all the power in this conversation. Imagine if a detective brought in a suspect for questioning, and then that suspect just goes off and threatens him until the detective is mumbling, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. Sorry, yes sir, please. In the end, this scene really shows Miranda as spineless and more than a little inept. I'm glad her character talked about it afterwards, but it could have easily been avoided. She wasn't really suggesting an awful thing at all. As it is now, the entire exchange comes off as incredibly awkward and a little silly. Here is a more powerful suggestion for how to rewrite the scene. It follows the normal course, perhaps even contains more exposition about the Covenant threat. When Quan starts airing her personal grievances against the UNSC, Miranda is taken aback but maintains her composure. Once Quan is done, Miranda responds with empathy, saying something like, I understand that I can never be in your shoes and experience the things you've had to go through, but the differences between us can end with you and me. Humanity is in danger. We can change things, and it can start here. But Quan doesn't respond, maybe even looks dismissively at her. Miranda continues, but I won't force you if you don't want to. She logs off and takes a deep breath on her end, an indicator of how difficult it was to remain professional and unemotional. We don't know yet whether she believes she was in the right, but it was her job to say that, and she did so. What this rewrite demonstrates is that Miranda isn't successful yet, but she has all the potential to one day lead and bring people together. Later, she can still gripe about how she failed to her father, but in reality, nobody has to win the argument between Quan and Miranda. It can end at an impasse with both characters demonstrating strength and deep personal values. This might even be great foreshadowing for a future friendship. Plus, the differences in their actions can shed light on how insurrectionists value independence and justice for the wrongs they've suffered, while the UNSC tries to make reparations and protect people, but has to remain unattached, stoic, and highly professional in order to preserve their sense of power. Overall, the revised scene accomplishes so much more and tells us a lot of information about the two factions and their respective characters. Because a big problem right now is Quan. As a character, she's starting to demonstrate a lot of very convenient Mary Sue qualities. First of all is her incredibly high survival rate. This is another reason why I personally would have preferred if her father had survived. With the beginning battle, her survival became more and more improbable the more helpless the situation got for everyone else who died just as easily. It would have been better if other people from Madrigal had survived, and perhaps Quan can get separated from them instead. With Halo being a military sci-fi, the theme of refugee families being separated by war would be entirely appropriate for the series. That would create stakes and a direction for Quan. Plus, her story would carry an insightful and powerful theme that average viewers might not expect from the show. Another issue is how Quan is just this kid who ends up winning arguments against Chief and Miranda. For some reason, this teenager leaves both of these military professionals stuttering and scrambling for excuses. Chief even divulges top secret mission details to a rebel girl he barely knows and doesn't actually owe an explanation to. just for the sake of arguing and then looking like an idiot. It makes Quan come off as very, I'm right because I'm actually just a puppet for the author's voice, which is another red flag for Mary Sue characters. Plus, as noted, it makes Chief and Miranda look incredibly incompetent so that Quan can be right, yet another Mary Sue characteristic. All of this is derived from the UNSC being developed as a faction that is only ever doing wrong and therefore can only ever be criticized. Had there been more depth to the world building, we wouldn't run into this sort of problem. Adding to that is the fact that the freedom-fighting insurrectionists aren't portrayed as the terrorists they originally were. I think this might be fleshed out in the future, but it isn't as of the first episode. A good way of balancing out the dynamics of the two factions would be during a scene on Reach. We could easily have a news report in the background detailing yet another insurrectionist attack with many civilian casualties. This way, the world wouldn't be so black and white, and Quan wouldn't have the convenience of being correct about anything and everything she argues about. Because let's face it, the only character who is right in every single argument is written by an author who wants to create scenarios in which they and their worldviews are only ever right. It's a huge writing flaw. Always be wary of preachiness in your writing. Just like how in the opening battle, where only the main characters can do useful things and survive, we get the sense that only the main characters can be objectively right and morally good. These are debilitating trends for the writing that I hope does not continue. My biggest personal red flag would be if they depict a battle between Marines and the Covenant, and only the Spartans are able to do anything useful in that fight. Nuance in things such as the battle scenes, the factions, and the characters themselves can provide for a variety of depth and layers to the narrative. Sadly, I don't have confidence that the level of writing so far can accomplish any of this. Having such clear-cut uselessness in factors that would otherwise be useful is shoddy writing for the sake of convenience, for saying, look how cool the main characters are, because everyone else is useless or morally wrong. But let's talk about the Covenant, the other side of the Human Covenant War. We haven't seen much except for their very accurate tendency for genocide, which is great, writing-wise. We also get a scene of high charity and get to see the Prophet of Mercy talking to a human who lives among them, and apparently teaches them about the Forerunners, if I'm correct. It might be implied she's doing this under duress, or at least has secret motivations. And it's true that the Covenant in canon have used human prisoners here and there to activate Forerunner tech, though that secret usually dies with them. I can't really say that I like seeing the dynamic set up in the show, where she seems like a holy figure in Covenant politics. I can watch it, but I can't exactly buy into it. I know they're just CGI aliens, but to be honest, she really isn't the best way to represent the most unique group in the show. It's kind of like representing a non-white foreign culture by having a white person be the spokesperson for that culture. We really couldn't have just seen the Covenant through the eyes of a certain high-ranking shipmaster who is zealous and efficient in his duties. Are we sure that's the best writing decision to be made when depicting new cultures? To not even have a member of that culture have the chance to represent themselves? If this really was someone's draft, I'd say just get rid of this character. Maybe make the actress a likable Marine character or something. And speaking of, let's address the Marines really quick. First of all, being a veteran, I think it's hilarious and ironic that in the 26th century, the the UNSC Marines will have changed out MARPAT for the Army's old universal camouflage pattern. That definitely looks like it in the pictures there. Granted, this isn't a criticism, I just think it's funny. If we look at the Halo 3 Marine designs, you can see that their BDU beneath the armor is actually very reminiscent of the Army combat uniform used when the game was released. I always appreciated that, so hey, at least somebody found that pattern useful. Otherwise, the Marine armor looks really cool. My favorite scene in this episode was when the Marines were gearing up, the Pelicans were being fueled and the Warthogs brought forward. We got to see all of the cool toys. But okay, this was just a deviation from the talk about writing quality. What I hope the show doesn't do is portray the Marines as useless meatheads who are only good for getting killed like stormtroopers. In Halo, the Marines were the heart of the game, always providing a good contrast to the Chief. The Marines were always energetic and wisecracking, but they were vulnerable and in many cases doomed to die, and yet still defiant to the end. Chief, on the other hand, was stoic, calm, and quiet. He was closed off from others and nearly invincible as a result. His lack of human connection was tragic, but it kept him alive and focused on his role of saving humanity. And the Marines were his foil, the best of the best, but they're only human. So hopefully, the show can give them personality. But I don't think the writers have prioritized their ability to write about military dynamics and how it appears in a military sci-fi. They come off as seeing the military as this black and white, do as you're told because we're all robots kind of environment. And it's incredibly generic, if not blatantly ignorant. I also dislike how they introduced Halsey. Parangosky wields power over her like a taskmaster. And just like with Miranda, you can see a moment where Halsey is a little intimidated by the Oni director's threats. To be honest, it makes Halsey look like some kind of weasel who's scrambling for scientific funding.
I'm sorry?
I wasn't a fan of how Halsey was trying to make herself seem important enough to Parangosky, rather than being able to trade blows and hold her own. Both characters would be much stronger if they were able to threaten the power of one another, choosing instead to remain out of each other's hair, even as they acted against one another in secret. But there's really no subtlety in what we currently have. As for Chief's face reveal, it's clear that we didn't really earn it. It really just felt like Pablo 117 at the end there, and as much as he's a great guy, the scene itself was underwhelming. He didn't actually have to take his helmet off to symbolize humanity and trustworthiness. And writing-wise, Chief didn't actually need Quan to trust him. Their trust is as contrived as the remote control management of his ship. They've only just met and she clearly has beef with him. Chief could have just allowed her to keep that distrust while he hijacks the ship and goes where he needs to in order to save her life. In that scene, she should have shot him, only for his shields to negate the bullets. Chief could then approach and calmly lower her rifle so he can go about saving her life. This attitude would be a parallel to the actions that humanized him in Halo Infinite, where he is this impossibly calm presence to the panicking pilot, which doesn't seem real, and yet he himself later deconstructs that it isn't real. He is vulnerable in many ways. But overall, I would have just done away with all of the remote control, brainwashing, and Condor scenes and then have this plot unfold on Reach if we really have to have it. In conclusion, there is a lot to be done before this could be a polished work. It should be kind of clear that I couldn't really enjoy this series, despite all of the moments where we could really see the hard work of the cast and crew. There were aspects of the storytelling that needed to go back to the drawing board for one or two more drafts. And after hundreds of drafts or so already, that's a little disappointing. I wish they'd gone with more from canon, but I'm fully aware that it's not a thing here. Reboots for movies and shows with their own twist are a common thing in Hollywood. Superhero movies do it to so many varying degrees, such as The Dark Knight. But we also have to remember that Dragon Ball Evolution did it as well. There are equal parts success and failure to storytelling, and a careless writer can easily fall on the wrong side of that spectrum. A Halo adaptation sits on a goldmine of potential, and what I wonder is, if that resource isn't used, why not just make an entirely original sci-fi show? Maybe I might enjoy this story more if it had just been called The Cyborg Soldier or something. But what do you guys think about the writing of this show? Remember, we're talking mostly about the craft of storytelling here, and much less about CGI or the lack of Steve Downes. Anyway, feel free to hit like or subscribe, and then you can finish the fight in the comments down below. Thank you. I'll see you guys next time.